just lived with the wound, carrying it through their days like a weight that never lightened. There was another category of harm within healthcare settings, one that operated differently from the cases of Evan, Isla, and Nora, but shared the same fundamental dynamics of trust and power. This involved not direct killing but a different kind of predation, one that left victims alive but damaged, their trust in medical professionals shattered, their bodies violated in ways that medicine was supposed to protect against. The case that illustrated this involved a physician, a man who will be called Dr. Julian Cross in this telling, though his real name appears in court records and medical board disciplinary actions in multiple states. Julian was not a hospital employee, but rather a specialist who ran his own practice, seeing patients on referral for complex medical issues that required expertise beyond what primary care physicians could provide. Julian's specialty was neurology, and he was by all accounts highly skilled at diagnosis and treatment of neurological conditions. Patients came to him with migraines, seizures, movement disorders, nerve pain. They came frightened and suffering, hoping for answers and relief. They were predisposed to trust him because he was a doctor, because he had impressive credentials displayed on his office wall, because their own doctors had referred them to him as an expert. Julian was in his mid-40s, handsome in a distinguished way, with graying hair and an expensive wardrobe. He spoke with confidence and warmth, made patients feel heard and cared for. His bedside manner was exceptional, which is why many patients specifically requested him, why his practice was successful despite charging rates that were on the higher end of the specialty. But Julian's interest in his patients was not entirely professional. He had developed a pattern of targeting certain patients, primarily women between the ages of 25 and 45 who came to him with conditions that caused pain or neurological symptoms. He would gain their trust over multiple appointments, establishing himself as someone who understood their suffering, who believed them when other doctors had dismissed their concerns. Then he would suggest treatments that required sedation or medications that impaired cognition and memory. He would tell patients they needed nerve blocks performed in his office, procedures that required them to be partially sedated. He would prescribe medications for anxiety or sleep that left patients foggy and confused. And during these states of vulnerability, he would touch them inappropriately, assault them in ways they might remember only in fragments or not remember at all. The nature of his specialty made this particularly insidious. Patients with neurological conditions often experience strange symptoms, memory problems, altered sensations. If they had vague recollections of being touched inappropriately during a medical procedure, they might dismiss it as a confused memory, a side effect of medication, a misunderstanding of a legitimate examination. Julian relied on this confusion, this self-doubt. He was careful to target patients who were already doubting their own perceptions, who were used to having their symptoms dismissed as psychological or exaggerated. He was also careful to create situations where there were no witnesses. He would dismiss his staff when performing the procedures in question, claiming the patient needed privacy or that he preferred to work without interruptions. This went on for years. Julian saw hundreds of patients, and he victimized dozens of them, leaving a trail of trauma that many of his victims did not even fully recognize as such. They would leave his office feeling violated but uncertain, wondering if they had imagined it, if they were being unreasonable, if this was just the uncomfortable reality of medical procedures performed on intimate parts of the body. Some victims did speak up, reporting their experiences to the office staff or to their referring physicians. But their complaints were met with skepticism. Dr. Cross was well-respected, established, professional. Surely there must be some misunderstanding. Surely the patient was confused by the medication or misinterpreting a legitimate medical exam. The complaints were noted but not acted upon, filed away in personnel records that no one looked at comprehensively enough to see the pattern. It was only when one patient, a woman named Ashley Parker, refused to let her complaint be dismissed that the pattern finally came to light. Ashley was 32, a lawyer, someone used to being believed and taken seriously. She had come to Dr. Cross for treatment of chronic migraines that had become debilitating. He had been kind and attentive, had prescribed various medications, had suggested a series of nerve block injections that he said might provide significant relief. During the third injection procedure, Ashley was given a sedative. She remembered lying on the exam table, feeling drowsy but not fully unconscious. She remembered Dr. Cross speaking to her in a soothing voice, telling her to relax, that the procedure would only take a few minutes. And then she remembered hands on her body in places that had nothing to do with a nerve block in her neck, touching her in ways that were unmistakably sexual. She said something, tried to pull away, but her body was heavy and uncooperative from the sedative. Dr. Cross had told her it was part of the examination, that he needed to check for referred pain patterns, some medical jargon that made no sense, but that she was too impaired to argue with in the moment. When the appointment ended, Ashley left feeling violated and confused. She went home and tried to make sense of what had happened. She researched nerve block procedures online, looked for any mention of the kind of touching she had experienced. She found nothing. She replayed the encounter in her mind, trying to be objective, trying to determine if she was misremembering or overreacting. But she knew what she knew. She was a lawyer. She was used to evaluating evidence, assessing credibility. And she knew that what Dr. Cross had done was not a legitimate medical procedure. It was assault. Ashley filed a complaint with the state medical board. She provided a detailed account of what had happened, including dates, times, the specific medications she had been given. The medical board investigator was professional, but clearly skeptical. They received complaints against physicians regularly, many of which were unfounded or exaggerated. Without witnesses or physical evidence, it would be difficult to substantiate Ashley's claims. But Ashley was persistent. She hired a private investigator to look into Dr. Cross, to see if there were other complaints, other patients who might have had similar experiences. The investigator found 6 women who had filed complaints against Dr. Cross over the past 10 years, complaints that had been filed with various entities, the medical board, the police, his professional liability insurer, but that had never been compiled into a comprehensive case. Ashley contacted each of these women. Some were reluctant to talk, having tried to move on from their experiences. But 3 agreed to speak with her, and their stories were remarkably similar to her own. Procedures performed alone, sedatives that left them impaired, touching that was clearly sexual but presented as medical, a sense of violation followed by confusion and self-doubt. Armed with these additional accounts, Ashley went back to the medical board. She also contacted a journalist who specialized in investigative reporting on medical misconduct. The journalist interviewed the women, reviewed medical records, spoke with experts about whether the procedures Dr. Cross claimed to be performing had any legitimate medical basis. The resulting article was published in a major newspaper, and it opened the floodgates. Within weeks of publication, more than 30 women came forward with similar accounts of being assaulted by Dr. Cross during medical procedures. Some of the accounts went back more than 15 years. The pattern was undeniable. Dr. Cross had been using his position as a physician to access and assault vulnerable women for the majority of his career. The medical board suspended his license pending a full investigation. The police opened a criminal investigation. Dr. Cross hired a high-powered defense attorney and denied all allegations, claiming that the procedures in question were legitimate medical examinations and that any discomfort patients felt was due to misunderstanding the nature of neurological exams. But the evidence was overwhelming. Expert witnesses testified that the procedures Dr. Cross claimed to be performing were not standard practice, that there was no medical reason to touch patients in the ways described. The medications he had prescribed were shown to be stronger and more impairing than necessary for the stated purposes. Most damning was the testimony of his former office staff. A medical assistant who had worked for Dr. Cross for 5 years testified that he had routinely dismissed her from the room when performing certain procedures, telling her the patient needed privacy. She had thought it was odd but had not questioned it because he was the doctor, the authority figure. Looking back, she realized he had been creating opportunities to be alone with vulnerable patients. Dr. Cross was eventually convicted on multiple counts of sexual assault. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison and required to register as a sex offender. His medical license was permanently revoked. The women he had victimized filed civil lawsuits, and his malpractice insurance and personal assets were depleted paying settlements. But the damage he had caused extended far beyond the individual women he had assaulted. Every patient who had ever seen him, even those he had not victimized, had to wonder whether their treatment had been appropriate, whether they could trust their memories of their appointments. The physicians who had referred patients to him felt guilty and betrayed, questioning whether they should have noticed something, should have protected their patients. The case also exposed systemic failures in how complaints against medical professionals are handled. Dr. Cross had been the subject of multiple complaints over many years, but because those complaints were filed with different entities and never compiled into a comprehensive review, the pattern had remained invisible until a victim with the resources and determination to investigate had connected the dots. This fragmentation of oversight was not unique to Dr. Cross's case. Medical professionals are licensed by state boards, credentialed by hospitals and insurance companies, and subject to discipline by professional organizations. But these entities rarely communicate with each other effectively, so a physician who faces complaints in one state can move to another and start fresh, or a physician who loses hospital privileges can continue practicing in an office setting without those restrictions. The reforms that followed Dr. Cross's conviction included mandatory reporting requirements that would create a national database of complaints and disciplinary actions against medical professionals, making it harder for predators to move between jurisdictions and settings without their histories following them. But implementation was slow and incomplete, hampered by concerns about physician privacy and the administrative burden of maintaining such a database. The women who had been victimized by Dr. Cross had varying outcomes. Some found healing through therapy and the validation of seeing him held accountable. Others struggled with trust issues that affected their ability to seek medical care, even when they needed it. Ashley Parker, who had been instrumental in bringing Dr. Cross to justice, left her law practice and became an advocate for victims of medical sexual abuse, working to change policies and support other women going through similar experiences. But even with Dr. Cross in prison, the fundamental dynamics that had enabled his crimes persisted. Patients still had to trust medical professionals with access to their bodies, still had to accept vulnerability as a condition of receiving care. Most medical professionals honored that trust, but the existence of people like Dr. Cross meant that trust always carried risk. The case illustrated another variation of the pattern seen with Evan, Isla, and Nora. The way authority and institutional settings create opportunities for harm. The way complaints are dismissed or minimized until they reach a critical mass that cannot be ignored. The way victims are made to doubt their own perceptions and experiences. It also showed how different types of harm could occur within healthcare settings. How the same dynamics of trust and power could be exploited for different purposes by different people. Evan killed for reasons even he did not fully understand. Isla killed out of a twisted sense of mercy. Nora killed out of anger and convenience. Julian assaulted for sexual gratification and the exercise of power over vulnerable women. The specifics differed, but the underlying pattern was consistent. A person in a position of trust using that position to harm those who had no choice but to be vulnerable to them. And systems that were supposed to protect patients failing to do so, either through active negligence or passive indifference. These were not isolated incidents. Research on medical misconduct suggested that for every case that became public, there were many more that never came to light, either because victims did not report, or because reports were not taken seriously, or because the evidence needed to prove wrongdoing was impossible to obtain. The true scope of harm within healthcare settings was unknowable, hidden behind walls of professional courtesy, institutional liability concerns, and the profound power imbalance between providers and patients. What was known was that it happened more than anyone wanted to acknowledge, and that the mechanisms designed to prevent and detect it were inadequate to the task. Julian Cross's case did lead to some changes in how medical practices were supervised and how complaints were handled, but it did not fundamentally alter the dynamics that made such abuse possible. Patients still had to trust. Doctors still had power. The potential for that power to be abused remained, constrained only by individual ethics, and the hope that systems would catch those who crossed the line before too many people were harmed. For the women Julian had victimized, these systemic issues were less important than their individual experiences of violation and recovery. Each had to find her own way forward, had to decide how to integrate this trauma into her life story, how to move past it without letting it define her completely. Some managed this better than others. Some found that speaking out, contributing to his prosecution, gave them a sense of agency that was healing. Others preferred to remain anonymous, to process their experiences privately without the additional trauma of public disclosure. But all of them had to live with the knowledge that they had been betrayed by someone they had trusted to help them, that the vulnerability they had accepted as a necessary part of receiving medical care had been exploited in the worst possible way. That knowledge changed them, made them more cautious, more skeptical, less willing to surrender control even when doing so was medically necessary. This was part of the broader harm these cases caused. They eroded trust not just in individual bad actors, but in the institutions and professions those actors represented. Every story of a killer nurse or an abusive doctor made it harder for patients to trust the good nurses and doctors they encountered, made it harder to accept the vulnerability that medical care requires. Healthcare providers who were honorable, who would never abuse their positions, found themselves facing increased skepticism and scrutiny from patients who had heard too many stories like these. They had to work harder to earn trust, to prove they were safe, to overcome the barrier of fear that these cases had created. This was perhaps the most insidious aspect of medical misconduct. It poisoned the well for everyone. It took the relationship between provider and patient, which should be built on trust and mutual respect, and introduced suspicion and fear. It made both sides more guarded, less willing to be vulnerable with each other, and that guardedness made good care harder to deliver. The irony was that the healthcare system needed that trust to function effectively. Patients needed to be honest about their symptoms, compliant with treatment recommendations, willing to undergo uncomfortable or frightening procedures. Providers needed to be able to act with autonomy, to make quick decisions, to have access to patients' bodies and medical information. When trust eroded, both sides suffered. Patients withheld information or refused necessary care out of fear. Providers practiced defensive medicine, ordering unnecessary tests and procedures to protect themselves from liability. The relationship became transactional rather than therapeutic, and everyone involved paid a price. These stories, Evan, Isla, Nora, Julian, represented different manifestations of the same underlying problem. What happens when the people we must trust to care for us in our most vulnerable moments betray that trust? But they were not the only stories. They were simply the ones that had become visible, that had been investigated and prosecuted and made public. For every case that reached the courtroom, there were others that existed only in whispers, in sealed settlements, in administrative actions that never made the news. There were nurses who were quietly fired for medication discrepancies that might or might not have indicated diversion. There were doctors who lost privileges at one hospital and simply moved to another without their history following them. There were nursing aides who were accused of rough handling or neglect, but who were never charged because the victims were too impaired to provide credible testimony. The visible cases were the tip of a much larger iceberg, and what lay beneath the surface was unknowable because the systems designed to track and prevent misconduct were fragmented, under-resourced, and often more concerned with institutional liability than patient safety. One of the recurring features in these cases was the role of witnesses who noticed something wrong but did not act on their concerns, at least not initially. These were the colleagues who had uncomfortable feelings about a coworker, who noticed patterns that seemed off, who heard things that made them uneasy, but who convinced themselves they were overreacting or misinterpreting. Mara Ives, the nurse who had suspected Evan Calder, lived with regret about not speaking up sooner, more forcefully. Rebecca Torres and David Kim, who had monitored Isla Rowan, wondered if babies might have been saved if they had gone to authorities earlier, instead of trying to build a case first. Sandra Mills, who had confronted Nora Kells, was haunted by the thought that she might have noticed the pattern sooner if she had been paying closer attention. These witnesses were not villains. They were ordinary people trying to navigate impossible situations with incomplete information and significant risks. To accuse a colleague of harming patients was not a casual thing. It could destroy careers, including your own if you were wrong. It could create a hostile work environment, make you a pariah among your peers. It required being certain enough to risk everything on your suspicions. But certainty was hard to come by. The people who committed these crimes were often skilled at presenting a normal facade, at explaining away anomalies, at making their actions seem reasonable in the moment. They benefited from the presumption of competence that came with their credentials and positions, from the reluctance of others to believe that someone trusted with caring for the vulnerable could be actively harming them. This created a kind of paralysis among potential witnesses. They knew something felt wrong, but they could not articulate exactly what or prove it conclusively. So they watched and worried and ultimately, in many cases, did nothing until the evidence became so overwhelming that it could not be ignored. The question of what should have been done differently, of where the responsibility lay for stopping these predators sooner, was complex and did not have easy answers. Yes, individual witnesses could have been more proactive, could have reported their concerns earlier and more aggressively. But those individuals were operating within systems that were not designed to make such reporting easy or safe. Healthcare institutions had powerful incentives to avoid scandal, to handle problems quietly rather than publicly. When someone raised concerns about a staff member, the typical institutional response was to investigate internally, document carefully, and if the concern seemed credible but unprovable, to encourage the person to resign or transfer rather than face formal discipline. This protected the institution from liability while passing the problem to someone else. Even when institutions wanted to do the right thing, they faced legal and practical constraints. Labor laws protected employees from arbitrary termination. Professional licensing boards required clear evidence of wrongdoing before revoking licenses. The healthcare system was chronically understaffed, making it difficult to suspend or remove workers even when there were legitimate concerns. All of these factors combined to create an environment where predators could operate with relative impunity as long as they were reasonably careful. The system was not designed to catch them, and it actively resisted efforts to expose them because exposure carried costs that institutions were unwilling to bear. Reform efforts following high-profile cases typically focused on creating better reporting mechanisms, stronger oversight, clearer protocols for investigating allegations. These were worthwhile changes, but they addressed symptoms rather than root causes. The root cause was the fundamental power imbalance between caregivers and patients, and the trust that patients had no choice but to extend to the people caring for them. That imbalance could not be eliminated. It was inherent in the nature of healthcare. Sick people, injured people, dying people had to place themselves in the hands of professionals who had knowledge and skills they did not possess. There was no way around that reality. The question was how to create safeguards that protected patients without making it impossible for healthcare providers to do their jobs effectively. Some reforms focused on transparency, on making information about providers' disciplinary histories publicly available so patients could make informed choices about who to trust with their care. But these efforts ran up against privacy concerns and the reality that many patients had limited choice about their providers, especially in rural areas or when dealing with specialized care. Other reforms focused on creating systems for reporting concerns that protected whistleblowers from retaliation and ensured that complaints were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. But these systems were only as good as the people implementing them, and institutional cultures of protecting the institution over protecting patients were deeply entrenched. Perhaps the most promising reforms were those that focused on changing workplace culture, on creating environments where speaking up about concerns was normalized and supported rather than punished. This required leadership that prioritized safety over reputation, that was willing to investigate allegations even when they were uncomfortable or inconvenient, that protected people who raised concerns rather than making them pay a price for doing so. But culture change was slow and difficult. It required sustained effort over years, not just policy announcements and training sessions. It required modeling the behavior you wanted to see, holding people accountable when they retaliated against whistleblowers, demonstrating through consistent action that patient safety truly was the top priority. Some healthcare organizations did this work successfully. They created cultures where staff felt empowered to speak up, where concerns were investigated promptly and thoroughly, where transparency was valued over secrecy. These organizations had better patient outcomes, lower rates of preventable harm, and staff who felt more satisfied and engaged in their work. But these organizations were still the exception rather than the rule. Most healthcare facilities struggled with the same problems that had enabled Evan, Isla, Nora, and Julian to harm so many people: understaffing, high turnover, burnout, financial pressure, and institutional cultures that prioritized efficiency and liability management over deep commitment to patient safety. The families of the victims in these cases often became advocates for change, channeling their grief and anger into efforts to prevent future tragedies. They testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger oversight. They worked with patient safety organizations to develop better protocols. They shared their stories publicly to raise awareness about the risks and warning signs. This advocacy work was important and valuable, but it was also exhausting and often frustrating. Change happened slowly, and even when policies improved, implementation was uneven. The families had to relive their traumas repeatedly, telling their stories to policymakers and journalists and anyone else who might have the power to make things better. Some found this work healing, found purpose in trying to ensure that what happened to their loved ones did not happen to others. Others found it re-traumatizing, a constant reminder of what they had lost and how the system had failed them. There was no right way to grieve or to respond to these tragedies, and families made different choices about how involved they wanted to be in reform efforts. What united them was the desire for some kind of meaning to come from their losses, some sense that their loved ones' deaths or suffering had not been entirely in vain. If stricter oversight prevented even one future incident, if better reporting mechanisms caught one predator before they could harm dozens of people, then perhaps there was some small redemption in that. But the truth was that no amount of reform or advocacy could bring back the people who had been lost. No systemic change could undo the harm that had been done. The families had to live with the reality that their loved ones had been betrayed by people who were supposed to care for them, had died or been violated in settings that were supposed to be safe. This was the cruelest aspect of these cases, the violation of the most basic human trust. We all face vulnerability at some point in our lives: illness, injury, aging, the frailty that comes with being mortal. In those moments, we have to trust others to care for us when we cannot care for ourselves. The social contract says that those entrusted with that care will honor it, will use their power to help rather than harm. When that contract is broken, when the people who are supposed to heal instead hurt, it shakes something fundamental in our understanding of how the world is supposed to work. It makes us question whether we can ever really trust anyone, whether safety is ever more than an illusion we cling to because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. The cases explored here: Evan Calder's methodical killing of hospital patients, Isla Rowan's attacks on helpless infants, Nora Kels's drug-fueled murders of nursing home residents, Julian Cross's systematic sexual assault of patients. These represented different forms of betrayal, but shared the same core violation of trust. They also shared the same pattern of institutional failure. In each case, concerns were raised but not adequately addressed. Patterns were visible but not fully investigated. Warning signs existed but were rationalized or ignored until the harm became so extensive that it could no longer be denied. This pattern was not unique to healthcare. Similar dynamics played out in other institutions where vulnerable populations had to trust authority figures: schools, churches, youth sports organizations, care facilities of all kinds. Wherever there was a power imbalance and an expectation of trust, there was potential for abuse. But healthcare settings had specific features that made the problem particularly acute. The vulnerability of patients was extreme. They were often unconscious, sedated, in pain, cognitively impaired. The harm that could be inflicted was severe and irreversible. The opportunity for abuse was constant because care required intimate access to bodies and complete trust in the caregiver's intentions. And the consequences of abuse often went undetected because death and suffering were expected in healthcare settings. A patient who died in a hospital did not automatically trigger suspicion. A patient who reported feeling violated during a medical procedure was easily dismissed as confused or overreacting. The normal operation of healthcare created cover for predators, made their crimes blend into the background noise of routine tragedy. This was what made these cases so chilling. Not just what the individual perpetrators had done, but how easily they had been able to do it, how long they had been able to continue, how many opportunities there had been to stop them that were missed or ignored. The question that haunted everyone involved, the families, the witnesses, the investigators, the policymakers, was whether these tragedies could have been prevented. If someone had acted sooner, if systems had been better, if institutions had prioritized safety over reputation, would these people still be alive? Would these victims have been spared? The answer was almost certainly yes, at least in some cases. If Evan Calder had been properly investigated at his first hospital instead of quietly transferred, he might have been stopped before killing 17 people across 3 facilities. If the concerns about Isla Rowan had been taken seriously earlier, fewer babies might have been harmed. If Nora Kels's substance abuse had been addressed, her victims might have been spared. If the complaints against Julian Cross had been compiled and investigated comprehensively, his pattern of assault might have been stopped years earlier. But hindsight was perfect, and the real-time decisions that people faced were murkier, more ambiguous. The witnesses who suspected something wrong could not be certain. The institution's investigating concerns had to balance competing priorities and legal constraints. The systems designed to protect patients were imperfect, under-resourced, fragmented across multiple jurisdictions and entities. This did not excuse the failures, but it contextualized them. The problem was not primarily individual malice or incompetence, but rather systemic inadequacy, structures that were not designed to catch the kind of sophisticated predators who learned to game them. Fixing those structures required more than just better policies. It required a fundamental shift in how healthcare institutions understood their responsibilities, how they prioritized patient safety versus other concerns like reputation and liability, how they supported staff who raised concerns rather than punishing them. It required acknowledging that the presumption of trust that society extended to healthcare professionals, while necessary and usually warranted, could also create blind spots that predators exploited. It required finding ways to maintain that trust while also maintaining vigilance, to believe in the goodness of most caregivers while remaining alert to the reality that some would betray that trust catastrophically. This was difficult, uncomfortable work. It meant living with uncertainty, with the knowledge that perfect safety was impossible, that risk could be reduced but never eliminated. It meant accepting that vulnerability was inherent in being human, in needing care, and that the people we trusted with that vulnerability would usually honor it, but sometimes would not. The stories told here were extreme examples, cases where betrayal was so extensive and egregious that it could not be ignored or minimized. But they existed on a continuum with lesser harms that happened every day in healthcare settings. The nurse who was rough with a patient out of frustration, the doctor who dismissed legitimate concerns, the aide who neglected basic care because they were overwhelmed and understaffed. Not all of these harms rose to the level of criminal conduct, but they all represented failures to honor the trust that patients had placed in their caregivers. They all contributed to the erosion of that trust, made patients more fearful and defensive, made the therapeutic relationship more difficult. Understanding the extreme cases, the Evan Calders and Isla Rowans and Nora Kelses and Julian Crosses, required understanding the continuum they existed on, the way small ethical compromises could lead to larger ones, the way burnout and cynicism could corrode empathy and compassion. It required recognizing that most healthcare workers were doing difficult, important work under challenging conditions, and that supporting them, with adequate staffing, reasonable hours, mental health resources, strong ethical training, was not just good for the workers, but essential for protecting patients. Because the alternative to supporting healthcare workers was creating conditions where more would burn out, more would make dangerous compromises, more would cross lines that should never be crossed. The system needed to be structured to bring out the best in people, not to grind them down until they had nothing left to give. After the convictions, after the sentencing hearings, after the media coverage faded, the families were left with their grief and their questions. The most persistent question, the one that many could never fully answer, was simply, why? Why had Evan Calder killed 17 people? He had offered explanations during his confession and its sentencing. Something about mercy, about control, about a brokenness inside him. But those explanations felt inadequate. They described what he had done, but did not truly explain it in a way that made emotional sense. Why had Isla Rowan harmed babies, the most innocent and helpless victims imaginable? Her claims about ending suffering felt like rationalization rather than genuine motivation. A story she told herself to justify actions that had deeper, darker roots. Why had Nora Kells murdered elderly people in her care, people who had done nothing to her beyond being demanding or difficult? Her confession mentioned anger and stress and addiction, but the gap between those common human experiences and serial murder felt unbridgeable. Why had Julian Cross used his position as a healer to assault vulnerable women? The psychology of sexual predation was somewhat better understood than that of killers, but it still raised the question of how someone could betray trust so thoroughly, so repeatedly, with such apparent lack of conscience. The criminal justice system was not designed to answer why questions. It answered what questions and sometimes how questions. Did this person commit these crimes? Can we prove it beyond reasonable doubt? What sentence should be imposed? These were the questions courts addressed. But families needed more than legal accountability. They needed to understand, to make some kind of sense of what had happened, to find a narrative that could contain their grief and rage and help them move forward. The justice system could not provide that, and the perpetrators themselves often could not or would not. Psychologists and criminologists who studied serial killers and predators offered theories. Some emphasized childhood trauma and attachment disorders, the way early abuse or neglect could damage a person's capacity for empathy and connection. Others focused on personality disorders, particularly antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, which could manifest in callous disregard for others and grandiose sense of entitlement. Still others looked at situational factors, the way certain environments and opportunities could enable and even encourage harmful behavior in people who might not have acted on destructive impulses in other settings. The healthcare setting, with its combination of authority, access, and expected suffering, created conditions that predators could exploit. None of these theories provided complete explanations. Human behavior, especially behavior as extreme as serial murder or systematic sexual assault, rarely had single causes. It was more likely a combination of factors: individual psychology, life experiences, opportunity, rationalization, and perhaps elements that would never be fully understood because they existed in the interior life of the perpetrator in ways that could not be articulated or accessed. The families had to make peace with this incompleteness. They would never fully understand why their loved ones had been targeted, why the people who were supposed to care for them had instead harmed them. They could learn the facts of what happened, could see the perpetrators punished, could work to prevent future tragedies, but the why would always remain partially opaque. Some families found meaning through their faith traditions, understanding the perpetrators as manifestations of evil or brokenness in a fallen world, trusting that divine justice would provide ultimate accountability even if earthly justice felt insufficient. Others found meaning through activism, channeling their pain into efforts to protect future potential victims. Still others found no meaning at all, concluded that what had happened was simply terrible and senseless, a random collision of vulnerability and predation that could not be redeemed or explained. They lived with the wound, carried it through their days, found ways to continue existing alongside it without requiring it to make sense. The perpetrators themselves, when they spoke about their motivations, often provided answers that were either too simple or too complex to be satisfying. Evan Calder talked about wanting to end suffering, but he had killed people who were not suffering, who were expected to recover. He talked about feeling powerful, but the power he described seemed hollow, unsatisfying. Isla Rowan claimed she was trying to prevent suffering, to spare babies from prolonged medical interventions. But she had harmed babies who were not suffering excessively, who had good prognosis. Her stated motivation did not align with her victim selection. Nora Kells was perhaps the most honest, acknowledging that she killed out of anger and convenience and a desire for control in a life that felt chaotic. But even she could not fully explain the progression from stressed nurse to serial killer, the moment when taking pills that were not hers became giving fatal doses to patients. Julian Cross offered no meaningful explanation at all. He denied wrongdoing throughout his trial, and even after conviction, he maintained that he had been providing legitimate medical care. His refusal to acknowledge his crimes, much less explain them, left his victims without even the cold comfort of understanding why they had been targeted. This absence of adequate explanation was itself traumatic for many victims and families. They wanted to understand, to have the perpetrator look them in the eye and provide an account that made sense, that allowed them to close the loop on what had happened. But that closure was rarely available. The mental health professionals who worked with these families often emphasized that the need to understand was natural but could become an obstacle to healing if it prevented people from accepting the limits of what could be known. Sometimes the work of grief involved letting go of the why question, accepting that it could not be fully answered, and finding ways to live with that uncertainty. But that was difficult work, perhaps the most difficult part of the healing process. It meant relinquishing the hope that complete understanding would somehow make the loss more bearable, would provide the key to processing the trauma. It meant accepting that some things were fundamentally senseless, that looking for meaning in them was futile. The cases explored here represented different types of harm, different motivations, different victim populations. But they shared certain elements that made them particularly devastating: the betrayal of trust, the exploitation of vulnerability, the institutional failures that allowed the harm to continue. They also shared the element of ordinariness. These were not obviously monstrous people living on the margins of society. They were professionals with credentials and jobs, and colleagues who thought well of them. They moved through the world looking and acting like normal people, even as they committed extraordinary crimes. This ordinariness was part of what made the cases so disturbing. It challenged the comforting narrative that predators are recognizably different, that we would know them if we saw them, that our instincts would warn us away. The reality was that predators often looked exactly like everyone else, that they were skilled at presenting a normal facade, that the warning signs they showed were subtle and easy to miss or misinterpret. This meant that the burden of detection fell largely on systems rather than individuals. No one could reasonably be expected to identify a predator just by interacting with them. The Evan Calders and Julian Crosses of the world were too skilled at deception for that. What was needed was robust systems that could detect patterns, that tracked outcomes across multiple providers and settings, that took complaints seriously and investigated them thoroughly. But building such systems was expensive and complicated. It required data infrastructure, analytical capacity, institutional will, legal frameworks that protected whistleblowers and facilitated information sharing across organizations and jurisdictions. It required prioritizing long-term patient safety over short-term concerns about reputation and liability. Progress was being made, slowly and unevenly. The high-profile cases did lead to reforms. Background check requirements became more stringent. Reporting systems improved. Some states created registries of healthcare workers who had been disciplined or convicted of crimes. Professional organizations developed better guidelines for handling allegations. But gaps remained. The healthcare system was vast and fragmented, with multiple types of providers working in multiple settings regulated by multiple entities. Creating comprehensive oversight was challenging, and predators who were determined and sophisticated could still find gaps to exploit. The families who had lost loved ones to healthcare predators had to live with this reality, that the systems had improved because of their losses, but not enough, not fast enough, not comprehensively enough to guarantee that it would never happen again. Other families would likely experience similar tragedies in the future, despite the reforms, despite the increased awareness. This was perhaps the hardest truth to accept, that vulnerability was inherent in being human, that needing care meant accepting risk, that the people entrusted with that care would usually honor it, but sometimes would not. Perfect safety was impossible. All that could be done was to minimize risk, create strong safeguards, respond quickly and decisively when problems emerged. The work of protecting patients was ongoing, never fully complete. It required constant vigilance, continuous improvement, unwavering commitment to prioritizing safety over all other considerations. It required believing that most healthcare workers were good people doing difficult work, while also remaining alert to the reality that some would betray that trust. This tension, between trust and vigilance, between believing the best about people and preparing for the worst, was difficult to maintain. It was tempting to collapse into either naive trust or paranoid suspicion. The challenge was to hold both realities simultaneously, to extend trust while also maintaining appropriate oversight. The stories told here were meant to serve as reminders of why that oversight mattered, why the work of protecting vulnerable people could never be considered finished. They were cautionary tales about what happened when systems failed, when trust was betrayed, when predators were allowed to operate unchecked. But they were also, in a strange way, testaments to resilience. Many of the victims and families had found ways to survive their traumas, to continue living meaningful lives despite what had been done to them. Some had channeled their pain into activism and advocacy. Others had simply persevered, had chosen to keep going even when the weight of what they carried seemed unbearable. This resilience did not erase the harm that had been done or make it acceptable, but it did demonstrate that even the worst betrayals, the most profound violations of trust, did not have to be the end of the story. People could survive, could heal incompletely but meaningfully, could find ways to live with wounds that would never fully close. The nurses and doctors and healthcare workers who had witnessed these betrayals also had to find ways to continue in their professions, to maintain their own capacity for trust and compassion despite having seen how those qualities could be exploited. They had to work alongside new colleagues without constantly wondering if they might be the next predator. They had to care for vulnerable patients without the reassurance of complete certainty that everyone else caring for those patients was safe. This was the burden that the predators left behind, not just the direct harm they caused to their victims, but the broader erosion of trust that affected everyone in the healthcare system. Every patient who hesitated to trust their nurse, every family member who questioned whether their loved one was really safe, every healthcare worker who second-guessed their colleagues. These were all part of the ripple effects of betrayal. Rebuilding that trust required transparency, accountability, and consistent demonstration that patient safety was truly the top priority. It required healthcare institutions to admit when they had failed, to learn from those failures, to make meaningful changes rather than just public relations gestures. Some institutions did this work well, took ownership of their failures, and made substantive reforms. Others did the bare minimum required by law or regulation, more concerned with limiting liability than with genuinely protecting patients. The difference between these approaches was visible in outcomes, in culture, in how staff and patients experienced care. The families who had been affected by these cases often became experts at evaluating healthcare institutions, at identifying the markers of a genuinely safety-focused culture versus one that just talked about safety while prioritizing other concerns. They learned to ask hard questions, to demand transparency, to not accept vague reassurances. This knowledge, born from terrible experience, was valuable but came at an enormous cost. No one would choose to gain such expertise through the loss of a loved one. But having paid that price, many families felt obligated to use their knowledge to protect others, to share what they had learned about warning signs and systemic failures. Their advocacy work, their willingness to speak publicly about their experiences, served an important educational function. It helped other families understand what questions to ask, what concerns to raise, how to navigate a complex healthcare system. It helped healthcare workers understand the patient and family perspective, the fear and vulnerability that came with needing care. But it also required these families to relive their traumas repeatedly, to stay connected to the worst moments of their lives for years or decades. The psychological cost was significant, and some advocates eventually had to step back to protect their own mental health and well-being. There was no right way to respond to these tragedies. Some families needed to fight, to channel their grief into action. Others needed to withdraw, to focus on private healing rather than public advocacy. Both responses were valid. Both represented different paths through impossible grief. What united the families was the permanent change in how they understood the world. Before their losses, most had assumed that healthcare settings were fundamentally safe, that people who wore scrubs and stethoscopes could be trusted implicitly. After, they knew better. They understood that trust had to be earned and maintained, that vigilance was necessary, that bad things could happen in places designed to heal. This knowledge was both protective and burdensome. It might prevent future harm by making them more alert to warning signs. But it also meant carrying permanent wariness, never fully relaxing into the trust that medical care required, always watching for signs of danger. For some, this vigilance became exhausting, interfering with their ability to receive necessary care or to allow their family members to receive it. The trauma of what had happened to their loved one made it difficult to surrender control again, even when doing so was medically necessary. Healthcare providers who treated these traumatized families had to be sensitive to this history, had to understand that apparent mistrust or excessive questioning was not personal, but rather a rational response to previous betrayal. They had to earn trust more deliberately, provide more reassurance, accept more oversight than they might with patients who had not experienced such trauma. This was part of the ongoing impact of cases like Evan Calder's or Julian Cross's. They changed not just the direct victims and their families, but rippled out to affect how healthcare was practiced and experienced more broadly. They made everyone more cautious, more skeptical, more aware of the potential for harm in settings designed for healing. The criminal trials and investigations generated extensive documentation, court transcripts, police reports, medical record reviews, witness statements. These documents told the stories in clinical, legal language, cataloging facts and evidence and procedural steps. But they could not fully capture the human experience of what had happened, the texture of grief and betrayal and rage that the families carried. One family, the Brennans, whose father Richard had been killed by Evan Calder, kept a journal during the investigation and trial. The daughter, Margaret, wrote in it almost daily, trying to process what she was learning about her father's death, about the nurse who had killed him, about the hospital that had failed to stop it. Her entries documented the progression from shock to anger to a kind of exhausted acceptance. Early entries were filled with disbelief. How is this possible? How did no one notice? Dad was getting better. The doctors said he would come home. Later entries turned angry. They knew. The hospital knew something was wrong, and they just moved him somewhere else. They let him keep killing people. They're as guilty as he is. The final entries, written months after Evan's sentencing, reflected a different kind of pain. I don't know how to stop being angry. I don't know how to accept that Dad is gone, that he was murdered, that the person who did it will eventually get out of prison and have a life while Dad has nothing. People tell me I need to forgive, to let go, to move on. But how? How do you move on from something like this? Margaret's struggle was echoed in the experiences of other families. The path from trauma to some form of healing was not linear. There were good days and bad days, periods of relative peace interrupted by triggers that brought the grief flooding back. Anniversaries, holidays, courtroom dates, news stories about similar cases. All could reopen wounds that had seemed to be closing. Support groups for families of murder victims helped some people. Meeting others who understood the specific pain of losing someone to violence, of having to navigate the criminal justice system, of living with unanswered questions provided validation and connection. But support groups could also be re-traumatizing, especially when members were at different stages of their journeys and newer members' raw grief reminded longer-term members of their own early pain. Therapy was helpful for many, particularly trauma-focused approaches that helped people process what had happened without being overwhelmed by it. But therapy required resources, time, money, mental energy that not everyone had access to, especially in the early aftermath when people were dealing with funeral arrangements, legal proceedings, and their own shock. The families also had to navigate relationships with the institutions where their loved ones had been harmed. Some maintained complete separation, wanting nothing to do with the hospitals or nursing homes where the tragedies had occurred. Others engaged in ongoing dialogue, working with hospital administrators on policy reforms, participating in safety committees, trying to ensure that their loved ones' deaths led to meaningful change. These relationships were complicated and often painful. Hospital administrators were constrained by legal concerns about liability, by insurance company directives, by competing priorities. Families wanted full transparency and accountability, wanted the institutions to admit fault and take responsibility. What they often got instead was carefully worded statements drafted by lawyers, settlements that came with non-disclosure agreements, changes that felt more cosmetic than substantive. The gap between what families needed and what institutions were willing or able to provide was a source of ongoing frustration. Families felt that hospitals were more concerned with protecting their reputations and limiting financial exposure than with genuinely addressing the failures that had allowed predators to operate. And they were often right. Institutional incentives did push toward minimizing liability rather than maximizing transparency. Some families pursued civil litigation, filing wrongful death lawsuits against the hospitals and the perpetrators. These cases could take years to resolve, requiring families to maintain engagement with the trauma for extended periods. Depositions required them to recount what had happened in excruciating detail. Defense attorneys would question them aggressively, looking for ways to minimize the hospital's responsibility or reduce the damages awarded. The financial settlements that eventually resulted provided some measure of material compensation, but money could not restore what had been lost. Most families said that the litigation was more about accountability than compensation, about forcing the institutions to publicly acknowledge their failures, about creating a record that might prevent future harm. But even successful litigation had limits. Settlements often came with confidentiality clauses that prevented families from speaking publicly about what they had learned through discovery. The institutions would agree to pay money without admitting wrongdoing, allowing them to frame the settlement as a business decision rather than an acceptance of responsibility. This legal maneuvering felt like another betrayal to many families. They had fought for truth and accountability, and what they got was a check and a gag order. The money helped with practical matters: funeral expenses, therapy costs, lost income from time spent dealing with the aftermath, but it did not provide the closure or justice that families had hoped for. The perpetrators themselves were largely absent from this ongoing process. Once convicted and imprisoned, they disappeared from the family's direct experience, existing only as abstractions. Families could not confront them, could not demand answers to their remaining questions, could not get the apologies or explanations they needed. Some families wrote letters to the imprisoned perpetrators, trying to articulate their pain, to make the perpetrators understand the human cost of what they had done. Most letters went unanswered. The perpetrators who did respond often wrote things that felt hollow or self-serving, apologies that seemed designed more to make the perpetrator feel better than to provide anything meaningful to the recipients. Victim impact statements at sentencing hearings provided one opportunity for families to directly address the perpetrators, to look them in the eye and describe the harm they had caused. These statements were cathartic for some, allowing them to finally speak their truth in a setting where the perpetrator had to listen. For others, they felt futile, shouting into a void, addressing someone who seemed incapable of truly understanding or caring about the pain they had inflicted. The criminal justice system's focus on the perpetrator rather than the victim meant that families often felt marginalized in the process. The case was the State versus Evan Calder, not the Brennan family versus Evan Calder. Prosecutors made decisions about plea deals and sentencing recommendations based on what they thought they could prove and what they thought was just, but families did not always agree with those decisions and had limited input. This sense of being sidelined in their own tragedies added to the family's frustration and pain. It was their loved ones who had been killed, their lives that had been shattered, but they were treated as witnesses rather than parties, consulted but not empowered, informed but not included in decision-making. Some jurisdictions had victim advocates who worked to give families more voice in the process, who explained what was happening and why, who helped families prepare impact statements and navigate the complexities of the legal system. These advocates were invaluable when they existed and were well-trained, but they were not available everywhere, and even the best advocacy could not fully address the fundamental power imbalance in how the system treated victims versus defendants. The families also had to contend with public attention, especially in high-profile cases that attracted media coverage. Reporters wanted interviews, wanted to tell the human story behind the legal proceedings. Some families chose to engage with media, hoping that sharing their stories would raise awareness and prevent future tragedies. Others wanted privacy, wanted to grieve without cameras and microphones, without seeing their worst moments turned into content. The media coverage itself was often problematic. Stories focused on the sensational aspects: the nurse who killed, the doctor who assaulted, sometimes losing sight of the victims and their families. Headlines emphasized the perpetrators' names and crimes, relegating victims to footnotes. Families would see their loved ones described simply as a patient or a victim, their full humanity reduced to their role in someone else's story. Some media outlets were sensitive to these concerns, worked to center victims' stories and respect families' wishes about privacy and coverage. Others were exploitative, pursuing grieving families aggressively, publishing details that families wanted kept private, framing stories in ways that maximized shock value without regard for the impact on those directly affected. The families had little recourse against this kind of coverage. Public interest in the cases meant that media had broad rights to cover them, to publish information that was part of the public record, to pursue stories even when families asked them not to. The only protection was to refuse interviews and hope that the story would move on to the next tragedy quickly enough that the intrusion would be brief. For families who chose to engage with media, there were both benefits and costs. Telling their stories publicly could be empowering, could give them a platform to advocate for change, could ensure that their loved ones were remembered as people rather than statistics. But it also meant opening themselves to public scrutiny, to judgment from strangers, to the permanent presence of their trauma in the public record. Online coverage was particularly difficult to manage. Stories would be shared on social media, where comment sections filled with speculation and judgment, and sometimes outright cruelty. People who had no connection to the cases would weigh in with opinions about what the families should have done differently, how they should be grieving, whether they deserved sympathy or compensation. The families learned to avoid reading comments, to protect themselves from the casual cruelty of internet strangers. But the knowledge that these conversations were happening, that their pain was being discussed and dissected by people who knew nothing about their actual experiences, added another layer of violation. Some families found community online, connecting with other families who had experienced similar tragedies through support groups and forums. These connections could be valuable, providing understanding and solidarity from people who truly knew what it was like. But online spaces also carried risks. The permanence of what was shared, the potential for privacy breaches, the difficulty of knowing whether the people you were connecting with were who they claimed to be. The investigation and trial processes also created divisions within families. Different members had different needs and different views about how to respond to what had happened. Some wanted to pursue every possible avenue of accountability, while others wanted to try to move forward. Some wanted to speak publicly about their experiences, while others wanted privacy. These differences could create conflict and tension at a time when families needed to be supporting each other. Siblings might disagree about whether to sue the hospital. Spouses might have different views about how to honor the deceased's memory. Extended family members might feel excluded from decisions or might insert themselves in ways that felt intrusive. Grief did not automatically create unity, and the additional stress of navigating legal and institutional systems could exacerbate existing family tensions. For Margaret Brennan and her family, these tensions played out around the question of whether to accept the hospital's settlement offer. Margaret wanted to reject it and take the case to trial, to force a public accounting of what had happened. Her brother wanted to accept it, to get the financial compensation and move on with his life. Their mother was caught between them, exhausted by the conflict and the ongoing engagement with the trauma. Eventually, they accepted the settlement, but the decision left Margaret feeling like she had compromised her father's memory, had allowed the hospital to buy its way out of true accountability. Her relationship with her brother was strained for years afterward, both of them feeling hurt and misunderstood by the other's position. These family dynamics were rarely visible in the public stories about the cases. Media coverage focused on the crimes and the perpetrators, sometimes on the advocacy work that families did afterward, but rarely on the internal struggles and conflicts that were part of the aftermath. Yet these private struggles were as real and as painful as the more visible aspects of the tragedies. Therapy helped some families navigate these conflicts, providing a space to process different needs and perspectives, to find ways to respect each other's choices even when they disagreed. Family therapy specifically focused on grief could help members understand that different grief responses were normal, that conflict was often a manifestation of pain rather than genuine incompatibility. But not all families had access to therapy or were willing to engage in it. Some worked through their conflicts over time, finding their way back to each other as the acute phase of grief subsided. Others remained fractured, the tragedy creating permanent rifts that could not be bridged. The children who lost parents to these predators faced particular challenges. They had to grow up with the knowledge that someone had murdered their mother or father, that the person who was supposed to care for them had instead killed them. They had to navigate questions from peers and teachers about how their parent died, decide how much to share, manage the attention and sometimes unwelcome sympathy that came with being a murder victim's child. For younger children, understanding what had happened was developmentally challenging. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that a nurse killed grandpa? How do you help a child process betrayal and institutional failure when they are still learning to trust the world? Parents and caregivers had to find age-appropriate ways to talk about the tragedies, to be honest without being overwhelming, to validate the child's feelings while also providing reassurance. Adolescents faced different challenges. They understood more about what had happened, but they were also navigating their own developmental tasks around identity and autonomy and trust. Having a parent or grandparent murdered by a healthcare worker during adolescence could profoundly affect how a young person learned to trust authority, to engage with institutions, to make sense of a world where people in positions of trust could betray that trust so completely. Some children of victims became advocates themselves as they grew older, speaking publicly about their experiences, working for reform, honoring their deceased parent or grandparent, by trying to prevent future tragedies. Others wanted nothing to do with the issue, wanted to build lives separate from the tragedy that had defined their childhood. Both responses were understandable and valid. There was no obligation to turn trauma into advocacy, no requirement to make meaning from senseless loss. Some people healed by engaging with the cause, others by moving away from it. What mattered was that each person found a path forward that worked for them, that allowed them to live with what had happened without being consumed by it. The partners and spouses of victims faced their own distinct challenges. They lost not just a loved one, but a future they had planned together, a shared life that was cut short by another's actions. They had to navigate grief while often also managing practical matters, finances, household responsibilities, supporting children through their own grief. Some partners eventually remarried or found new relationships, which brought its own complications. How do you honor the memory of a spouse who was murdered while also building a new life with someone else? How do you integrate a new partner into a family still marked by tragedy? These were delicate negotiations with no clear roadmap. Other partners never partnered again, feeling that doing so would somehow betray the deceased, or simply not having the emotional energy to open themselves to that kind of vulnerability again. They built lives as single parents or single adults, finding meaning and connection in other ways. The parents who lost adult children to these predators faced a grief that was particularly acute. Parents are not supposed to outlive their children. The natural order feels violated when a child dies before a parent, and when that death is a murder, the violation is compounded. These parents often described feeling that their own purpose had been stolen, that they no longer understood what they were living for. Support for bereaved parents existed through various organizations and support groups, but the specific circumstances of losing a child to a healthcare predator added layers of complexity. The betrayal of trust, the institutional failures, the questions about what could have been done differently. All of these complicated the grieving process in ways that parents of children who died from other causes did not have to navigate. The question of forgiveness arose differently for different families, and there was no consensus about whether it was necessary, possible, or desirable. Some religious traditions emphasized forgiveness as essential for healing, as something done not for the perpetrator's benefit, but for the victim's peace. Other perspectives rejected the idea that victims had any obligation to forgive, that forgiveness should be earned through genuine remorse and restitution rather than extended as a gift. Margaret Brennan struggled with this question for years. Well-meaning friends and some family members suggested that forgiving Evan Calder would help her heal, would free her from the burden of anger. But Margaret did not feel that anger was a burden she needed to be freed from. She felt it was an appropriate response to what had happened, that letting go of it would mean letting go of her father's memory, of the injustice that had been done. She eventually came to a place that was not exactly forgiveness, but was not consuming rage either. She accepted that Evan Calder was a damaged person who had done terrible things, that he would face consequences for those actions, and that her ongoing anger at him was not changing anything about his situation or bringing her father back. She chose to redirect her energy toward advocacy rather than toward hating Evan, but she did not frame this as forgiveness. It was simply a choice about where to focus her limited emotional resources. Other families made different choices. Some did extend forgiveness, finding that it brought them peace in ways nothing else had. They forgave not because the perpetrator deserved it, but because carrying hatred felt like allowing the perpetrator to continue harming them, to occupy space in their hearts and minds that they wanted to reclaim. Still others remained angry, felt that forgiveness would be a betrayal of their loved ones, that the perpetrators should never be released from the weight of what they had done. These families found meaning in their anger, used it as fuel for advocacy, as a reminder of why the work of protecting vulnerable people mattered. There was no right answer, no correct way to process these feelings. Each family, each individual, had to find their own path through the impossible terrain of grief and betrayal. What helped was having space to make those choices without judgment, without pressure to forgive or not forgive based on others' expectations. The long-term health impacts of this kind of trauma were significant. Research on grief showed that losing a loved one to homicide carried higher risks of complicated grief, depression, anxiety, and PTSD than other types of bereavement. The sudden, violent nature of the loss, combined with the criminal justice process and often media attention, created conditions for lasting psychological harm. Many family members developed symptoms consistent with PTSD, intrusive memories of learning about the death, nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, exaggerated startle responses. Anniversaries and triggers could bring flashbacks and acute distress even years after the events. Treatment for these symptoms existed: trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, medication for depression and anxiety, but accessing treatment required resources and the capacity to engage in difficult therapeutic work. Not everyone was ready for that work immediately, and waiting lists for trauma specialists could be long. Physical health was also affected. The chronic stress of grief and trauma took a toll on immune function, cardiovascular health, sleep quality. Family members reported increased rates of illness, chronic pain conditions, fatigue. The mind-body connection meant that psychological trauma manifested in physical symptoms, creating a cycle where poor physical health made it harder to address psychological distress, and vice versa. Financial impacts added another layer of stress. Time away from work for court proceedings, therapy appointments, and simply managing grief affected income and career trajectory. Medical expenses for treatment of grief-related health issues added up. Legal fees for civil litigation could be substantial, though many wrongful death attorneys worked on contingency, taking payment from settlements rather than requiring upfront fees. For families who had been providing financial support to the deceased, or who had been receiving such support, the economic impact was immediate and severe. A working adult killed by a healthcare predator left behind not just grief, but often financial crisis for dependents. Life insurance helped when it existed, but it could not fully replace lost income, especially when the deceased had been young with many working years ahead. The combination of psychological, physical, and financial stressors created conditions where families were vulnerable in multiple ways simultaneously. Support systems that might have helped, extended family, community connections, workplace flexibility, were not always available or adequate to the scale of need. Some families found that their faith communities were sources of tremendous support, providing meals, childcare, financial assistance, and most importantly, a community that showed up consistently over time rather than just in the immediate aftermath. Other families found that their religious communities did not know how to handle the specific pain of murder, or offered platitudes about God's plan that felt more harmful than helpful. Workplace responses varied widely. Some employers were compassionate and flexible, allowing extended leave, reduced hours, or other accommodations as families navigated their grief and the demands of the legal system. Others were less understanding, treating the tragedy as an unfortunate personal matter that should not affect work performance, creating additional stress as families tried to maintain employment while dealing with overwhelming circumstances. Schools' responses to children affected by these tragedies also varied. Good schools provided counseling support, communicated with parents about concerning behaviors, educated peers about how to be supportive, and made academic accommodations as needed. Less responsive schools expected children to maintain normal performance despite extraordinary circumstances, or handled the situation in ways that called unwanted attention to the grieving child. Social relationships often changed in the aftermath of these tragedies. Some friends proved unable to handle the intensity of the grief and trauma, pulling away or offering unhelpful platitudes. Others showed up in meaningful ways, providing practical support and emotional presence over the long term. Families learned who they could rely on, which relationships could bear the weight of what they were experiencing. New friendships sometimes formed with others who had experienced similar losses. These relationships had the benefit of mutual understanding. Both parties knew what it was like, did not need to explain the complexity of their grief, could be authentic about the ongoing impact without fear of judgment. But they also carried the risk of keeping families stuck in their identity as victims, of making it harder to develop relationships that were not centered on the trauma. The question of how to memorialize the deceased was important for many families. They wanted their loved ones remembered as full people who had lived meaningful lives, not reduced to their role as victims. They created scholarships in their names, planted memorial gardens, established charitable funds, organized annual remembrance events. These acts of memorialization served multiple purposes. They honored the deceased, kept their memory alive in tangible ways. They provided the families with active ways to channel their grief into something constructive. They created community around the loss, bringing together people who had known and loved the deceased. But memorialization also meant ongoing engagement with the loss, a choice to keep it present rather than try to move past it. This worked well for some families and felt burdensome for others. There was no wrong choice. Some people needed to actively remember, others needed to find ways to let go and move forward. The perpetrators' families faced their own difficult journeys. Evan Calder's elderly father had to reckon with his son being a serial killer. Isla Rowan's young daughter had to grow up knowing what her mother had done. Julian Cross's ex-wife had to process that the man she had been married to for 15 years had been assaulting patients throughout their relationship. These family members were secondary victims in some sense, not responsible for the crimes, but profoundly affected by them. They faced shame, social isolation, sometimes harassment from angry community members who held them somehow responsible for their relatives' actions. They had to navigate their own complicated grief, grieving who they thought their relative was, processing the betrayal of having been deceived, managing their own trauma responses. Some perpetrators' families became advocates in their own right, speaking about warning signs they wished they had recognized, about the importance of mental health treatment, about the ripple effects of these crimes on everyone connected to the perpetrator. Their advocacy came from a different place than victim family advocacy, but served a valuable purpose in humanizing a different aspect of these tragedies. Other perpetrators' families withdrew entirely, changed their names, moved to new communities where no one knew their connection to the crimes. They wanted to rebuild their lives without the constant reminder of what their relative had done, and that was understandable even if it meant removing themselves as potential sources of insight about the perpetrator's history and psychology. The communities where these crimes occurred also experienced collective trauma. In small towns like the one where Evan had worked at the rural hospital, everyone seemed to know someone who had been affected. The hospital was a major employer and central community institution. Having it revealed as a place where a serial killer had operated damaged community trust and identity. Town hall meetings were held where residents could express their anger and fear, where hospital administrators tried to explain what had happened and what they were doing to prevent future incidents. These meetings were often tense, with residents demanding accountability and administrators offering carefully worded statements that avoided legal liability while trying to restore confidence. The economic impact on small communities could be significant. Hospitals facing lawsuits and reputation damage sometimes had to cut services or staff. In some cases, they closed entirely, leaving communities without local healthcare access. This created a perverse outcome where the victims were harmed twice. First by the crime itself, then by the loss of healthcare services in the aftermath. Larger cities and institutions weathered these scandals more easily, absorbing the reputational damage and moving on. But even there, the cases left marks. Nursing students learned about them in ethics classes. Hospital administrators revised policies with these cases in mind. News coverage resurfaced on anniversaries or when similar cases emerged elsewhere. The true crime genre's treatment of these cases was complicated. Some documentaries and podcasts handled the stories thoughtfully, centering victims and examining systemic failures. Others were exploitative, focusing on the lurid details of the crimes, using victims' suffering as entertainment for an audience that would never be personally affected. Families had mixed feelings about this coverage. They appreciated when their loved ones' stories were told in ways that might prevent future tragedies, that educated the public about warning signs and institutional failures. They resented when their pain was packaged as content, when the perpetrators were lionized or romanticized, when the focus was on the killer's psychology rather than the victim's humanity. Some families participated in documentaries or podcast interviews, hoping to influence how the stories were told. Others refused all media contact, wanting to maintain control over their own narratives even if that meant the public story would be incomplete. Both choices came with trade-offs. Participation risked exploitation but offered some influence. Refusal protected privacy but meant losing control over how the story would be told. The passage of time brought changes in how families experienced their grief and trauma. The acute phase gradually gave way to something more chronic but less overwhelming. Life went on, not because the loss mattered less, but because the demands of living required attention. Jobs, other relationships, daily responsibilities, all continued and required energy. This return to some version of normal life sometimes brought guilt. How could they laugh at a joke when their loved one was dead? How could they enjoy a vacation when justice still felt incomplete? The idea that they should be perpetually grieving felt wrong, but so did the idea that they could move past it. Therapists helped families understand that healing did not mean forgetting or dishonoring the deceased. It meant learning to carry the loss in a way that allowed for continued living, for joy alongside sorrow, for presence in current relationships and experiences while still holding space for what had been lost. Some families marked this evolution by changing how they engaged with anniversary dates. Early years might involve visiting grave sites, public memorial events, intense private grief. Later years might be quieter, more personal, acknowledgement without consuming sadness. This shift was not linear. Some anniversaries hit harder than others, triggered by current life circumstances or news of similar cases or no apparent reason at all. The families who had become advocates found that their work evolved over time. Early advocacy was often driven by raw grief and anger, focused on punishing the institutions that had failed and preventing similar failures. Later advocacy became more systemic, focused on policy change, education, building sustainable support systems for future victims. This evolution required different skills and different emotional resources. Early advocacy could run on adrenaline and rage. Sustained advocacy required patience, political savvy, ability to work with people and institutions that families might have initially seen as enemies. Some advocates made this transition successfully, building careers around patient safety and victims' rights. Others burned out, stepped back, redirected their energy elsewhere. The policy changes that resulted from these cases were real but limited. Background checks improved but still had gaps. Reporting systems became more robust but still relied on people choosing to report, which fear and institutional pressure often prevented. Oversight increased but remained unevenly distributed across settings and states. Perfect prevention was impossible. As long as humans cared for other humans in conditions of vulnerability and trust, there would be potential for that trust to be betrayed. The goal was not to eliminate all risk, but to minimize it, to catch predators earlier, to create conditions where harm was harder to hide and easier to detect. The families who had paid the highest price for the previous system's failures watched these incremental improvements with mixed feelings. They were grateful that future potential victims might be better protected. They were frustrated that change came so slowly, that each reform seemed to require another tragedy to generate political will. They wondered about counterfactuals that could never be answered. If the current policies had been in place when their loved one was harmed, would they still be alive? If someone had spoken up sooner, acted on their concerns more decisively, prioritized patient safety over institutional reputation, would the outcome have been different? These questions had no answers, and pursuing them too relentlessly could drive a person mad. But they persisted, especially in quiet moments, especially on anniversaries and other significant dates. The families lived with these unanswerable questions alongside their grief, learning to hold both without being consumed by either. As years passed, some of the perpetrators became eligible for parole. This created new trauma for families who had thought the criminal justice phase was behind them. They had to prepare victim impact statements again, had to make their case to parole boards about why the perpetrator should not be released. Evan Calder would not be eligible for parole for 15 years from his sentencing. Families were already dreading that date, knowing they would have to relive the trauma, to argue for his continued incarceration, to potentially face him being released back into society. Nora Kells became eligible for parole after 8 years. The families of her victims organized, wrote letters to the parole board, attended the hearing. They argued that 8 years was not nearly enough time for 7 murders, that Nora had shown insufficient remorse, that releasing her would dishonor their loved ones and potentially put others at risk. The parole board denied her release, but she would be eligible again in 2 years, and again 2 years after that. The families would have to keep fighting, keep showing up, keep making their case, potentially for decades. This aspect of the criminal justice system felt particularly cruel to many families. The sentencing hearing was supposed to bring closure, but parole eligibility meant the case was never truly closed. They could never fully move on because every few years they would be pulled back into it, forced to relive the worst moments, to once again prove that their loved one's life mattered. Some states had laws that allowed victims' families to submit written statements for parole hearings without having to appear in person. This helped reduce the burden, but also meant families had less direct influence over the proceedings. It was a trade-off between protecting their own well-being and maximizing their advocacy impact. Isla Rowan would likely never be eligible for parole given her life sentence, but the families of her victims had to contend with a different ongoing trauma. Seeing her case discussed in true crime media, watching as people debated her psychology and motivations, sometimes encountering online communities that seemed to romanticize her as a misguided angel of mercy rather than recognize her as someone who had attempted to murder babies. The internet's capacity for distortion and reinterpretation of these cases was disturbing to families. Online forums would debate whether the perpetrators had really been evil or just mentally ill, whether the victims had been suffering anyway, whether the crimes were really as bad as the media made them seem. Families sometimes tried to correct misinformation in these spaces to represent their loved ones as real people rather than abstract victims. But engaging with internet strangers about the murder of their family member was often more traumatizing than helpful, and most eventually stopped trying. The question of public education about these cases was fraught. On one hand, people needed to know that these things happened, needed to understand warning signs, needed to be empowered to advocate for themselves and their loved ones in healthcare settings. On the other hand, creating too much fear could prevent people from seeking necessary care or make the therapeutic relationship impossible. Finding the right balance required nuance that media coverage often lacked. Headlines emphasized the shocking nature of the crimes without adequately contextualizing how rare they were. Stories focused on the predators without spending equivalent time on the millions of healthcare workers who provided excellent, ethical care every day. This created a distorted perception where some people became irrationally fearful of healthcare settings, seeing potential predators everywhere, refusing necessary treatments because they could not overcome their fear. This was an unintended consequence of the increased awareness about medical predators, and it created its own harm. Healthcare providers themselves had to navigate this changed landscape. They dealt with patients who were more suspicious, more questioning, sometimes openly hostile based on generalizations from these high-profile cases. This made their already difficult jobs even harder, creating adversarial dynamics where there should have been therapeutic alliance. Good providers understood that this suspicion was not personal, that it was a rational response to real betrayals that had occurred in healthcare settings. They worked to earn trust through consistency, transparency, and respect for patient autonomy. But it was exhausting to constantly prove that you were not a predator, to have your professional competence and ethics questioned because of what others had done. The healthcare institutions themselves struggled with how to address this history. Some implemented extensive new training programs on ethics and patient safety, on recognizing and reporting concerning patterns among colleagues. Others did the bare minimum required by regulations, hoping to avoid the topic rather than engage with it meaningfully. The difference was visible in organizational culture. Places that took the issue seriously created environments where staff felt empowered to speak up, where concerns were investigated promptly and thoroughly, where patient safety was clearly the top priority. These organizations had better outcomes, lower rates of preventable harm, and staff who felt more satisfied and supported in their work. Places that treated it as a checkbox exercise, something to document for accreditation purposes without genuinely integrating into practice, continued to have the same problems. Staff learned that speaking up was professionally risky, that the institution would prioritize protecting itself over protecting patients, that it was safer to keep your head down and your concerns to yourself. The regulatory and accrediting bodies that oversaw healthcare facilities had also learned lessons from these cases, though implementation remained uneven. Standards for background checks, for reporting suspicious patterns, for investigating allegations had all improved. But enforcement was inconsistent, and facilities that operated in areas with limited oversight could still cut corners. The tension between adequate oversight and excessive regulation was real. Too little oversight allowed predators to operate. Too much created administrative burden that diverted resources from patient care and could actually make care worse by forcing healthcare workers to spend their time on documentation rather than on patients. Finding the right balance required ongoing adjustment, learning from both successes and failures, being willing to modify policies when they proved ineffective or counterproductive. It required acknowledging that there was no perfect system, only iterative improvement toward better protection with fewer unintended negative consequences. The families who had become long-term advocates understood these complexities in ways that those newly affected often did not. They had learned through hard experience that good intentions were not enough, that policies could have unexpected effects, that change required patience and persistence and willingness to work within imperfect systems. They mentored newer victim families, helping them navigate the criminal justice system, the media, the complex emotions of grief and rage, and the desire for meaning. This mentorship was valuable, but also painful, as it required advocates to stay connected to the trauma that had shaped their own experiences while helping others through similar pain. Some advocates created formal organizations, 501c3, nonprofits dedicated to patient safety, victim support, or specific reforms. These organizations provided structure and resources for advocacy work, made it possible to pursue systemic change more effectively than individuals could alone. Other advocates worked more informally, simply making themselves available when contacted by families facing similar situations, offering support and guidance based on their own experience. This peer support was invaluable for newly bereaved families who needed to talk to someone who truly understood what they were going through. The therapy and support that advocates themselves needed was often overlooked. They were seen as strong, as having found purpose and healing through their work. But advocacy meant constant re-engagement with trauma, exposure to other families' pain, and the frustration of trying to change systems that were resistant to change. Advocates experienced vicarious trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue. They needed their own support systems, their own therapy, their own communities of care. Those who sustained their advocacy over long periods had found ways to protect their own well-being while doing the work, to set boundaries, to take breaks when needed. The measurement of success in this work was difficult. How do you quantify prevention? If policy changes meant that a predator was caught after 3 victims instead of 17, that was a success in terms of reducing harm, but it still meant 3 families destroyed. If increased awareness meant that one person spoke up about concerning patterns and an investigation happened before anyone was harmed, that might never be known or celebrated. Advocates had to find satisfaction in incremental progress, in small victories that might not feel commensurate with the effort invested. They had to maintain hope that the work mattered even when outcomes were uncertain or invisible. The alternative, doing nothing, accepting that the system was what it was and could not be changed, felt like dishonoring the deceased, like allowing their deaths to be meaningless. For many advocates, continuing the work was itself a form of memorial, a way of ensuring that their loved one's death had some positive impact, however small. But this also meant that stopping the advocacy work could feel like abandonment, like giving up on the deceased's memory. Some advocates who needed to step back for their own health struggled with guilt about that choice, feeling like they were failing their loved one by prioritizing their own well-being. Therapy helped reframe this understanding, helping advocates recognize that caring for themselves was not betrayal, that their own lives and health mattered, that they could honor the deceased in other ways beyond public advocacy. But these intellectual understandings did not always resolve the emotional conflict. The children who had been young when their parents or grandparents were killed by healthcare predators were now growing into adolescents and young adults. They had different perspectives on the tragedies than those who had been adults when they occurred, different memories, different needs. Some chose to engage with the cases as they matured, reading trial transcripts, watching media coverage, trying to understand what had happened with adult comprehension. Others preferred to keep distance, to remember the deceased as they had known them rather than engage with the details of their deaths. These choices sometimes created tension with parents or other family members who had been deeply involved in advocacy. A daughter who wanted to move on with her life without being defined by her grandfather's murder might feel pressure from a mother who had made advocacy central to her own healing. Or vice versa. A young adult who wanted to take up the advocacy mantle might feel unsupported by a parent who had deliberately tried to shield them from it. These generational differences required families to negotiate competing needs, to respect that each person had to find their own path through the shared tragedy. What worked for one generation might not work for the next, and that was okay even when it created friction. The question of how to talk about these cases in public spaces, schools, workplaces, social gatherings, was one that families navigated constantly. In casual conversation, when someone asked how a loved one had died, did you tell the truth? Did you say murdered by a nurse in the hospital? Or did you find some softer phrasing or change the subject? Some families were direct, believing that naming the reality was important, that euphemisms dishonored the deceased. Others were more circumspect, not wanting to make others uncomfortable, not wanting to be forever defined by this one terrible fact about their lives. The responses they got varied. Some people were compassionate and appropriate. Others said thoughtless things, asked invasive questions, responded with fascination rather than sympathy. Families learned to gauge who could handle the information and who would make it worse, learned to protect themselves from well-meaning but harmful responses. The exhaustion of constantly managing other people's reactions to their trauma was real. It meant that families could never fully relax in social situations, always had to be prepared for the conversation to go to difficult places, to manage their own reactions while also managing others. Some families found that their social circles shrunk as a result. It was easier to spend time with people who already knew, who did not need the story explained, who understood the ongoing impact. New relationships required energy for disclosure and education that families did not always have to spare. This social isolation compounded the other impacts of the tragedies. At a time when families most needed support and connection, the nature of what they had experienced made connection more difficult. The people who could have been sources of support sometimes became sources of additional stress instead. Faith and spirituality played complex roles in how families processed these tragedies. For some, religious beliefs provided comfort and framework for understanding, even if that understanding was incomplete. The idea that the deceased was at peace, that there was meaning or purpose beyond human comprehension, that justice would ultimately be served in a divine realm. These beliefs helped some families cope. For others, the tragedies shattered religious faith. The question of how a loving God could allow such betrayal, such suffering, had no satisfactory answer. Some families lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their beliefs with their experience. Still others found that their faith evolved, becoming more complex and less certain, but also more personal and meaningful. They let go of simplistic understandings of divine protection or plans, embraced mystery and doubt, found meaning in community and practice rather than in theological certainty. Religious communities sometimes provided the best support families received: meals, childcare, financial help, consistent presence over time. Other times, they failed spectacularly, offering platitudes that felt hollow, suggesting that insufficient faith was somehow to blame, withdrawing when the family's pain made them uncomfortable. The families learned that not all support was helpful, that they needed to be selective about where they turned for help, that protecting themselves sometimes meant declining offers that would create more burden than benefit. The question of how these cases should be taught in medical and nursing schools became important. Future healthcare providers needed to understand that these betrayals happened, needed to be educated about warning signs and reporting obligations. But the education needed to be done carefully, in ways that conveyed the seriousness of the issue without creating paranoia or damaging students' ability to trust their future colleagues. Some schools integrated these cases into ethics courses, using them as cautionary tales about what could happen when oversight failed, when concerns were not acted upon, when institutional priorities superseded patient safety. They discussed the specific failures that had allowed each predator to continue harming people, analyzed what should have been done differently, prepared students to be the colleagues who would speak up when they noticed concerning patterns. Other schools were more cautious, worried about frightening students or creating cynicism about the profession. They mentioned the cases briefly, if at all, focused more on positive examples of ethical practice, emphasized that these were extreme outliers rather than representative of healthcare workers generally. The families who had lost loved ones generally favored more explicit education. They wanted healthcare students to be confronted with these realities, to understand viscerally what could happen when the system failed, to be inspired to be part of the solution. They sometimes spoke to classes themselves, sharing their experiences, putting human faces on the abstract concept of patient harm. These presentations were difficult for the families to give, but felt important. If even one student was moved to pay closer attention to concerning patterns, to speak up when something felt wrong, to prioritize patient safety over professional courtesy, then the pain of sharing the story might prevent future tragedies. Students' responses varied. Some were deeply moved, committed themselves to being vigilant, saw the presentations as crucial learning experiences. Others were overwhelmed, struggled to integrate these stories into their developing professional identities, worried that they would become paranoid or unable to trust their colleagues. Faculty had to help students process these complex reactions, to find the balance between appropriate awareness and unhealthy suspicion, to understand that while these cases were real and important, they were also statistically rare, that most healthcare workers were ethical and competent. The licensing exams for nurses and physicians began to include more questions about ethical obligations, about how to report concerns, about what to do when you suspected a colleague of harming patients. This was a direct result of advocacy from families and patient safety organizations who argued that these topics were as important as clinical knowledge. But exam questions could test knowledge without changing behavior. Knowing that you should report concerning patterns was different from actually doing it when it meant confronting a colleague, risking professional relationships, potentially being wrong, and causing harm to someone's career. The cultural change needed in healthcare went beyond individual education to transformation of workplace environments. Hierarchies needed to become less rigid so that nurses felt empowered to question physicians, so that junior staff could raise concerns about senior colleagues, so that patients and families were treated as partners in care rather than passive recipients. Some healthcare systems made genuine progress on these cultural shifts. They implemented just culture frameworks that distinguished between human error and reckless behavior, that protected people who made honest mistakes while holding accountable those who violated safety norms. They created anonymous reporting systems that allowed staff to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. They trained leaders in how to respond to concerns in ways that encouraged future reporting rather than shutting it down. They made patient safety data transparent, sharing it publicly and using it to drive improvement rather than hiding problems to protect reputation. These organizations became models for others, demonstrating that culture change was possible, that it improved both patient outcomes and staff satisfaction. But they remained exceptions rather than the rule, requiring sustained leadership commitment and resources that not every organization could or would dedicate. The insurance industry also played a role in driving changes. Malpractice insurers who had paid out large settlements in cases involving healthcare predators began requiring stricter screening and oversight as conditions of coverage. They developed risk assessment tools, required regular audits of patient outcomes, insisted on specific policies and procedures. This insurance-driven change was motivated by financial rather than ethical concerns, but it had real impact. Organizations that wanted to maintain affordable insurance had to implement the required safeguards. Market forces accomplished what regulation sometimes could not. But insurance-driven change also had limitations. It focused on the most obvious risks, the patterns that were easiest to detect and prevent. More subtle forms of harm, or predators who were especially skilled at hiding their actions, might still evade these protections. The technology sector saw opportunity in addressing these problems. Companies developed algorithms to detect unusual patterns in patient outcomes, to flag providers whose patients had higher than expected complication or death rates, to analyze electronic health records for signs of tampering or falsification. These tools had promise, but also limitations and risks. Algorithms could identify patterns that human reviewers might miss, but they could also produce false positives that harmed innocent providers' careers. They relied on data quality that was often inconsistent across systems. They could be gamed by predators who understood how they worked and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Privacy concerns also arose. How much surveillance of healthcare workers was appropriate? At what point did monitoring for bad actors create an atmosphere of distrust that harmed the therapeutic relationship and drove good people out of the profession? These were questions without easy answers. The families who had lost loved ones to healthcare predators generally favored more monitoring, more surveillance, more safeguards, whatever it took to prevent future harm. Healthcare workers and privacy advocates worried about creating big brother environments where everyone was presumed guilty until proven innocent. The balance between safety and autonomy, between oversight and trust, remained contested terrain. Different stakeholders had different priorities and different tolerance for risk. Finding approaches that addressed multiple concerns simultaneously required ongoing negotiation and compromise. The media's role in shaping public perception of these issues continued to evolve. Some journalists did excellent investigative work, uncovering patterns that officials had missed, holding institutions accountable for failures, educating the public about warning signs and advocacy tools. This journalism served important public interest functions and sometimes led directly to policy changes or criminal investigations. Other media coverage was less responsible, sensationalizing the cases for ratings, focusing on lurid details rather than systemic issues, creating fear without providing useful information about how to protect oneself or advocate for change. The families had limited influence over how their loved ones' cases were covered. They could choose whether to participate in interviews, could try to steer conversations toward the issues they cared about, but ultimately journalists made their own editorial decisions about angle and emphasis. Some families became media savvy over time, learning how to deliver soundbites that conveyed their messages effectively, how to redirect unhelpful questions, when to decline interviews that would likely be exploitative. Others never became comfortable with media engagement and relied on victim advocates or attorneys to handle press inquiries. The question of whether true crime coverage of these cases served public good or exploited private tragedy remained contentious. Some families felt that any coverage that raised awareness was valuable, even if imperfect. Others felt that the entertainment framing of true crime fundamentally dishonored the victims, that turning their suffering into content for people's commutes and workouts was exploitative regardless of how sensitively done. The growth of the true crime genre meant that these cases would continue to be revisited, repackaged, discussed in podcasts and documentaries and books. Families had to decide how to engage with this ongoing coverage, whether to try to shape it or to distance themselves from it. Some families found unexpected connection through true crime communities. Listeners and viewers who engaged deeply with the cases sometimes reached out to offer support, to share how the stories had affected them, to contribute to memorial funds or advocacy organizations. These interactions could be meaningful and validating. But these communities could also be toxic, with people who felt entitled to information and opinions, who were more interested in the perpetrators than the victims, who treated the cases as puzzles to solve rather than human tragedies with ongoing impact. The families had to navigate these complex dynamics, taking what was helpful and protecting themselves from what was harmful. It was exhausting work that many had never anticipated having to do, additional burden on top of the grief and trauma they were already carrying. As the years passed, some of the questions that had seemed so urgent in the immediate aftermath became less pressing. The need to understand why, the desire for perfect justice, the hope that the right policy changes would prevent all future harm. These evolved into more modest and realistic goals. Families learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that they would never have complete answers, to find satisfaction in incremental progress rather than transformative change. They learned that healing was not linear, that triggers would continue to arise, that grief had no expiration date. They also learned that they could experience joy again, that laughter was not betrayal, that building new lives and new relationships did not mean forgetting or dishonoring the deceased. They learned to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that what happened was terrible and that they could still find meaning and purpose in their lives. The resilience they developed was not a choice so much as a necessity. They could not remain in the acute phase of grief indefinitely without being destroyed by it. So they found ways to carry it differently, to integrate it into their lives rather than being consumed by it. This did not mean they had gotten over it or moved on, phrases that always felt dismissive of the ongoing impact. It meant they had learned to live with it, to function despite it, to build lives that included space for the loss without being defined entirely by it. The relationships that survived and deepened through these experiences became precious. Family members who had supported each other through the worst times felt bonded in ways that would never be broken. Friends who had shown up consistently, who had not been scared off by the intensity of the grief, became chosen family. New relationships formed too, with others who had experienced similar losses, with advocates working on related causes, with therapists and support group facilitators and victim advocates who accompanied them through the journey. These relationships were built on shared understanding of pain, on mutual commitment to meaning-making and prevention. The communities that formed around these cases, both in person and online, provided spaces where families did not have to explain themselves, where the ongoing impact of the tragedies was understood and validated, where they could be authentic about their continuing struggles without fear of judgment. These communities also provided practical support, information about legal resources, recommendations for therapists who specialized in trauma, advice about dealing with media, strategies for self-care during particularly difficult times like anniversaries and parole hearings. The value of peer support could not be overstated. Professional help was important, but there was something irreplaceable about connecting with others who had been through similar experiences, who understood in ways that even the most skilled therapist could not if they had not personally experienced this kind of loss. As some of the original advocates aged or stepped back from active involvement, younger family members and newer victims began to take up leadership roles. This generational transition brought fresh energy and perspectives, new ideas about advocacy strategies, different comfort levels with technology and media. It also brought challenges. The founders of advocacy organizations had built them around their own experiences and priorities. Newer members sometimes had different visions for the work, wanted to take it in different directions, had different ideas about what success looked like. These transitions required negotiation and compromise, willingness to let go of control while also preserving the core mission and values that had animated the work from the beginning. Not all organizations navigated these transitions successfully, and some fractured or dissolved as a result. But the work continued, in various forms and through various organizations and individual advocates. The fundamental need to protect vulnerable people from predators in healthcare settings, to support families who had been affected, to push for systemic changes that would prevent future harm, persisted regardless of which specific individuals or organizations were carrying it forward. The legacy of these cases would extend far beyond the individual tragedies. They had changed how healthcare institutions thought about oversight and accountability. They had empowered patients and families to be more active advocates for their own safety. They had inspired reforms in licensing, credentialing, and reporting systems. They had also left permanent marks on everyone touched by them: the victims who survived, the families of those who did not, the healthcare workers who had witnessed the harm, the investigators and prosecutors who had pursued justice, the advocates who had worked for change. None of these people would be unchanged by their experiences. The betrayals had shaken their understanding of how the world worked, had forced them to confront human capacity for harm, had required them to rebuild trust that had been shattered. But many had also discovered strengths they did not know they possessed, had found meaning and purpose through the advocacy work, had built relationships and communities that sustained them. The tragedies had broken them in some ways and forged them in others. The question of prevention remained central to all the advocacy work, to all the policy reforms, to all the institutional changes. How could future tragedies be prevented? What safeguards would actually work? What trade-offs were acceptable in pursuit of greater safety? The answers were complex because the problem was complex. Healthcare predators were not a single type with a single profile. Evan Calder, Isla Rowan, Nora Kells, and Julian Cross had different motivations, different methods, different victim selection patterns. A safeguard that might catch one type might miss another. Comprehensive prevention required multiple layers of protection. Background checks to screen out those with documented histories of harm. Robust supervision and oversight to detect concerning patterns. Clear reporting mechanisms that protected whistleblowers and ensured investigations happened. Support systems for healthcare workers to address burnout and mental health issues before they escalated to patient harm. It also required cultural change, creating environments where speaking up was normalized and supported, where patient safety truly was the top priority, where institutional loyalty did not supersede obligations to protect vulnerable people. No single intervention would prevent all harm, but each layer of protection caught some percentage of potential predators, reduced the likelihood that those who slipped through one screen would make it through all of them, decreased the amount of time predators could operate before being detected and stopped. The families understood this imperfect reality. They knew that even with the best systems, some predators would still find ways to harm people. But they also knew that better systems meant fewer victims, earlier detection, reduced harm. That was worth fighting for even if it could not guarantee complete prevention. The conversation about prevention sometimes became contentious when it touched on issues of mental health and addiction among healthcare workers. Some argued that better support for struggling workers would prevent cases like Nora Kells, where substance abuse and burnout contributed to the descent into patient harm. Others worried that framing these crimes primarily as mental health issues excused the perpetrators, minimized their responsibility for choosing to harm others. They pointed out that many healthcare workers struggled with mental health and addiction without killing anyone, that the overwhelming majority found ethical ways to cope with their difficulties. Both perspectives had validity. Mental health support and addiction treatment for healthcare workers was important for many reasons, including but not limited to patient safety. But it was also true that mental illness and addiction did not inevitably lead to serial murder, that the perpetrators had made choices that most people facing similar struggles did not make. The prevention conversation needed to hold space for both truths, that systemic factors contributed to creating conditions where harm was more likely, and that individual perpetrators bore responsibility for their actions. Addressing systemic factors did not excuse individual choices, and holding individuals accountable did not negate the need for systemic change. The role of technology in prevention continued to expand. Electronic health records made it possible to track patterns across patients and providers in ways that paper charts never could. Automated surveillance systems could flag outliers and anomalies. Security systems created records of who accessed what information when, making it harder for predators to operate invisibly. But technology also created new vulnerabilities. Electronic records could be hacked or altered. Surveillance systems generated so much data that separating signal from noise was challenging. The technology was only as good as the humans interpreting its output and acting on its findings. There was also the risk that over-reliance on technology would create false confidence, a sense that if the algorithms did not flag anything, everything must be fine. Human judgment and intuition still mattered, still caught things that automated systems missed. The most effective prevention combined technological tools with human vigilance, using each to compensate for the other's limitations. Algorithms could process vast amounts of data to identify statistical anomalies, but humans needed to investigate those anomalies, to provide context, to make judgments about what they meant and what action was appropriate. Patient and family empowerment was another important prevention strategy. When patients and families understood what quality care looked like, when they knew what questions to ask and what concerns to raise, they became additional eyes and ears detecting problems. Some of the victims of these predators had expressed concerns that were dismissed. Families had noticed things that seemed wrong, had asked questions that were deflected or minimized. In retrospect, these concerns had been valid. If they had been taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, some of the harm might have been prevented. Teaching patients and families to trust their instincts, to persist when their concerns were dismissed, to escalate when initial reports were not taken seriously. This was important work. But it also placed additional burden on people who were already vulnerable, asking them to be vigilant and assertive at times when they were sick or frightened or exhausted. The prevention burden should not fall primarily on patients and families. The systems and institutions had responsibility to protect them, not to require them to protect themselves. But empowered patients and families could serve as additional safeguards, backup systems for when institutional protections failed. The question of what to do about predators who had served their sentences and were being released back into society was difficult. They could not be barred from working entirely, but they certainly should not be allowed to work in healthcare or any position involving vulnerable populations. Registries existed for some types of offenders, making their histories publicly accessible. Employment screening was supposed to catch these people and prevent them from working in positions where they could cause harm. But gaps existed in these systems, and determined individuals sometimes found ways to slip through. Evan Calder would eventually be released from prison if he lived long enough to reach parole eligibility and was granted release. He would be in his 50s, would have spent 15 to 20 years incarcerated. What would he do then? Where would he go? How would he survive? The families he had harmed were terrified of the prospect of his release. They organized. prepared to fight any parole application he might make. But they also knew that eventually, statistically, he would likely be released. Life sentences without parole were rare for the charges he had pled to. The prospect of encountering him in the community, of potentially seeing him at a grocery store or walking down a street, was nightmarish. Some families considered relocating when his release became imminent. Others talked about restraining orders, though the legal requirements for those were unclear in this context. The criminal justice system was designed around punishment and sometimes rehabilitation. It was not designed to provide lifetime containment for people who might remain dangerous even after serving their sentences. Families were left to navigate that gap, to protect themselves as best they could with limited legal tools. Nora Kells, who had already been released on parole after serving 8 years, lived in a halfway house under supervision. She worked a minimum wage job, reported regularly to her parole officer, attended mandated therapy. On paper, she was complying with all requirements of her parole. But the families of her victims knew where she was, tracked her through the registry system and informal networks. They watched for any sign that she might be attempting to work with vulnerable populations, ready to report any violation of her parole terms. This vigilance was exhausting but felt necessary. They did not trust the system to keep her away from potential victims. They felt they had to maintain their own surveillance, had to be the failsafe that protected others. This was another ongoing burden of these cases. The families sensed that they could never fully relax, never completely trust that the systems would work, always had to remain vigilant. It was a form of ongoing trauma, hypervigilance that might be adaptive in the short term, but took a toll over years. Therapists worked with families on finding balance, on identifying what vigilance was realistic and helpful versus what was consuming energy, without providing meaningful protection. But letting go of any vigilance felt dangerous, felt like failing their loved ones, and potentially enabling future harm. As the final minutes of this long narrative approach, we return to where we began, the quiet hallways of hospitals at night, the places where people go when they cannot care for themselves, where they must trust strangers with their most vulnerable moments. The monitors still beep in steady rhythms. The nurses still move softly through dim corridors. The patients still sleep or try to sleep, their bodies working to heal or at least to endure another night. Most of these nurses are good people doing difficult work. Most of these patients will wake in the morning, will gradually heal, will eventually go home to their lives. Most of the trust extended in these settings will be honored. Most of the vulnerability will not be exploited. But not always. Not everywhere. Not everyone. The cases explored here, Evan Calder, Isla Rowan, Nora Kells, Julian Cross, were real in the patterns they represented, even if the names were changed and some details were altered. They happened. They continue to happen, though hopefully less frequently as awareness increases and systems improve. The families who lost loved ones to healthcare predators carry permanent scars. They have learned things about human nature and institutional failures that no one should have to learn. They have had to rebuild their lives around absences that should never have occurred. But they have also demonstrated remarkable resilience. Many have channeled their grief into advocacy that has made real differences. They have supported each other through impossible pain. They have found ways to honor their loved ones by working to protect others. The work of protecting vulnerable people from predators in healthcare settings is never finished. New threats emerge. Systems that seemed adequate prove to have gaps. Vigilance must be maintained across generations and across changing contexts. This is not a story with a neat conclusion, with justice fully served and all problems solved. It is a story about ongoing struggle, about imperfect systems trying to do better, about the tension between necessary trust and appropriate vigilance. It is a story about the people we become when we face the worst betrayals, about how we survive what should be unsurvivable, about the meanings we make from senseless losses. Most importantly, it is a story about the continued need for all of us, healthcare workers, patients, families, administrators, policymakers, all of us, to remain committed to protecting the vulnerable, to speaking up when something seems wrong, to prioritizing safety over convenience or reputation or any other concern. Because the alternative, the cost of silence and inaction, is measured in human lives. In elderly patients who died before their time. In babies who were harmed when they should have been healing. In nursing home residents who were killed by someone they trusted. in patients who were violated when they were most defenseless. Their stories, their losses, their families' ongoing pain. These are the reasons the work matters. These are why we cannot become complacent, cannot assume the systems will protect without our active participation, cannot look away from uncomfortable truths about human capacity for harm. The hallways stay quiet. The monitors keep beeping. The night shift continues its routines. And somewhere, someone is paying attention, is noticing patterns, is asking uncomfortable questions, is choosing to speak up even though it would be easier to stay silent. That person, that choice, that moment of courage, these are what stand between safety and harm, between trust honored and trust betrayed. This is not a story designed to create fear of healthcare settings or distrust of healthcare workers. It is a story meant to inspire appropriate vigilance, informed advocacy, and commitment to the ongoing work of protecting vulnerable people. Most people who care for others do so with genuine compassion and integrity. But trust, once given, should not be blind. It should be earned through transparency, accountability, and consistent demonstration that patient safety is the true priority. The families who shared their pain through these pages, whose loved ones became statistics in cases that should never have happened, they ask only this: remember that these things can happen. Remember that prevention requires vigilance. Remember that speaking up matters. Remember that behind every case, every statistic, every policy reform, there were real people with real lives who deserved better than they got. And in remembering, commit to being part of the solution, to being the person who notices, who questions, who speaks up, who prioritizes protection of the vulnerable over personal comfort or professional courtesy. That is how we honor those who were lost. That is how we protect those who remain vulnerable. That is how we slowly, imperfectly, but meaningfully make these settings safer. The monitors keep beeping. The night continues. And the work of vigilance, of care, of protection, that work goes on. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for listening to these difficult stories. Remember to like this video if you found it meaningful. Subscribe to the channel for more content. And please, leave a comment below telling me where you're from and whether any of these stories resonated with your own experiences or concerns. Most importantly, if you or someone you love is ever in a healthcare setting and something feels wrong, trust that instinct. Ask questions. Demand answers. Advocate fiercely, because sometimes trust is not enough. Sometimes vigilance is what saves lives. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other.